And then I'm gonna ask you, how were you treated as an African American child in Portland?
And so I think I was treated really well. I as a child, um, up until high school, I really um, didn't experience personally any kind of racial animosity. And it wasn't until my senior year in high school when the tensions became really high at Linda McKinley. And part of that was because um, there were becoming more black students, and so blacks were being elected to class offices and homecoming queen and that kind of thing. And some white students, I can't put it on all white students at Linda, but some white students really couldn't handle that change. And so it wasn't until then that I really began to, and that was in the late 60s and early 70s. So that was from 1968 to 1971, which was pretty much the part of the heart of the civil rights movement when all these things were going on all over the country. But it wasn't until then that I started to experience some strain.
Okay. Do you remember anything about Martin Luther King?
Absolutely. Um, One of as I was growing up, especially so this would have been junior high and high school, the civil rights movement was big. And Martin Luther King actually was assassinated on my 15th birthday. So yeah, and in fact, it was a situation where, I mean, we like celebrating birthdays, as a lot of families do. My grandparents came over. We're gonna have ice cream and cake, and just as we were getting ready to sit down, it came on the news that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Right, right. So that was not much of a birthday party that day, and so I'll never forget that. But again, it was my 15th birthday.
How about JFK?
So I was 10 years old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I was in the fifth grade, I think, still in elementary school. I remember school being released that day. I remember coming home and my grandmother was crying. I'd never seen my grandmother cry. And my grandmother was crying. And it was just a really sad, just listening to African American adults talk about it at that time. I knew at 10 years old that that was a big deal, that this was somebody who was really important to the African American community, and he had been assassinated, and people were really sad and didn't know what was going to happen next. It was the same thing when I fast forward 5 years when I was 15 and Martin Luther King was assassinated. That was huge in the African American community, because he was the one who, even though it was very difficult and everybody didn't agree with him, because there was Malcolm X out there's Martin Luther King, there's the Black Panthers. I mean, I remember hearing about all that as a young high school student. But Martin Luther King seemed to be on the right trail and on the right track, and so many people were upset and distraught, not knowing what was going to happen to the community because he had been assassinated.
Do you recall any Jim Crow laws? Do you remember when they established it? And
So living in Columbus, we didn't, like in the north. You didn't necessarily see colored and white signs like on water fountains like you would in the south. But it wasn't until later that I understood that I had attended a segregated elementary school. I mean, so while you didn't have the signs, colored and white, there was still institutionally, there were still laws and there were laws that prevented blacks from doing certain things. For example, and my mother and I have talked about this a lot, there were, let me see if I can remember what they're called. I'll keep talking, and I'll remember the name as we're talking. But there were codes where in Columbus and in Ohio, where blacks couldn't live in certain areas. For example, blacks couldn't live south of it was either Broad Street or Long Street. You couldn't live there. Now it's pretty much an African American community now, but you couldn't. And if you go there, you'll see they're big, beautiful homes.
yeah.
But blacks couldn't. I almost had it. Restrictive covenants is what they were called. They were called restrictive covenants, and it restricted where blacks could actually live in Columbus. So while I didn't know that I was experiencing that growing up, I was.
Do you remember bus boycotts, sit-ins, Rosa Parks, any marches?
All that. I remember all that. The bus boycott, actually, I have to go back on that. I don't actually remember it because it happened in 1955 and I was born in 1953. So I was 2 years old. So it's not anything that I would remember, but obviously I have read a lot about it, and know a lot about it. And I think what people don't realize that was really an economic boycott because it shut down the bus system in Montgomery and really got the attention of people. And actually, economic boycotts or anything that impacts the flow of money will get the attention of individuals. If you look at what's gone on in Chicago most recently with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, those young people were out on the Magnificent Mile, which is the most exclusive shopping that you can find in Chicago. And so when they were stopping shoppers from going into those major stores on the Magnificent Mile, that's an economic impact, and an economic impact can change things. I mean, and that's what that bus boycott was all about. It was these people. I mean, if you read any of Martin Luther King's early books, those people were willing to do whatever it takes, walk however far they had to. They had what some people call jitneys, where they had individuals who would act as a cab. So I'd take my car and go pick up a lot of people and keep doing that and get them to work so they could because these folks could not afford not to go to work. They had to go to work because they had to feed their families, and public transportation was the way that they did it. So, that boycott was probably as I think back, probably the most effective boycott to affect change that has ever occurred in the United States, from my perspective. From my perspective.
And do you remember any news stories? Like, how did that affect you? Like, I talked about the marches. Did you see the Martin Luther King marches?
I wanted so badly I was just so mad that we didn't live in the South because, again, as a young teenager and a middle schooler, a junior high young person, I was looking at those things on TV and I wanted to be involved. And I really think it was at that point that I decided that I had to have a career that allowed me to help people and to do something with people and to make lives better. And I think it was at that moment I decided I was going to be an educator. I didn't know what I was going to do as an educator, but I think it was at that moment that I decided that. But those marches, just watching them and watching people when people marched during the civil rights era, they weren't dressed like you and I are, in jeans and a t-shirt. They were dressed in shirts and ties and hose and dresses because they wanted to present themselves as looking good, as being serious. And I think we can take some lessons from that. It's fine for us to be casual today. It's a Saturday. We're chilling. But I think we can take a lesson from that. When we're about business, we need to look like we're about business. So I think those marches taught particularly African Americans and particularly people like me more than, and I'm not minimizing it, just what they were accomplishing during with the march, but how you go about presenting yourself and taking care of business. So those are the things I remember.
Any last minute thoughts or biggest memory?
Yeah, well, I think I've talked to you about my biggest memory, and that was the impact that the assassination of Martin Luther King had on the African American community, on me personally. And I really did wonder at that time, like, what's going to become of us? What's going to happen? Who's going to speak out for us? Who's going to make sure that African Americans have a shot? And now, obviously looking back, I understand the impact that Dr. King had not only on African Americans but minorities everywhere, especially in the United States, and women, and just getting people to pay attention that everybody deserves a shot. I think it, some of these things are cyclical. I think that you and other young people like you ought to be very aware of what's going on on the political scene right now, what's being said, what candidates are saying. You should be very aware. You must register all your 18-year-old friends. They need to register and vote now and never miss an election. I'm very proud to say that after I was able to register to vote, I have never missed an election, an opportunity to vote. Make sure your voices are heard, because I think some of those same awful things that were occurring with African Americans, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and actually from slavery to now, from 1619 through the civil rights era, I think there is a possibility that the hands of time could be turned back, depending on who was elected. And so you all need to take advantage of the fact that we all have the right to vote. It is our right, is our God-given right. Nobody can take it away from us. And if people try to take it away from us, and us now, I'm talking about everybody, tries to take it away from us, we should fight to the death for it not to happen. Because I just really am concerned about what's being said out there in the political scene right now. So,
Okay, well, thank you.
thank you. It's been my pleasure.